without further ado, I would like to introduce the distinguished panelists that we have today. For a complete bio, you can look at the back of the program. And without any particular order, I will like to introduce Miguel del Valle, former state senator and Chicago city clerk. Now he chairs the P2 Council on Education. We also have Judith Gethner, director of the Illinois Partners for Human Services. Silvia Puente, executive director of the Latino Policy Forum. Robin Staines, Executive Director of Advance Illinois. And I believe I don't missing anybody. So let's just move on to one of the most important issues that we all heard about it recently. The media covered it extensively, and that is redistricting. As you know, that's kind of a dense topic. It's key, it's critical to the Latino community. So we thought we'll start with that and learn how it went, what are the lessons, and what are the advantages or disadvantages that came down from Springfield. And the first question, if you don't mind, Miguel, you've been through the process. You were a plaintiff back in the 1980 redistricting of the redistricting lawsuit, and could you walk us through what you have seen in all these years, and why this process is so important for the Latino community?
Do you really want me to say what I have seen in all these years?
Yes, please. Yeah, that'll be great.
As it relates to redistricting,
it's off the record, by the way.
Thank you.
Right.
It's not off the record. We do have, and this will be taped and be it will be on CAN TV. So just we'll let you guys know when it'll be taped and aired.
Thank you for that reminder. I had forgotten. I was the lead Latino plaintiff for the first redistricting case brought by Maldiv in 1981. And at that time, we had zero representation in the Illinois General Assembly. Latinos had attempted to run for office for state rep prior to 1981, but of course they were not successful. And so it wasn't until we won the case in 1981 that the first real opportunity to elect a Latino to the Illinois General Assembly presented itself. And as a result of that, in 1982, the first Latino was elected to the House of Representatives. And it was a few years after that, to be exact, 1986, when I was then elected the first Latino to the state Senate. The next round of redistricting was one that we were involved with again, but again, there was the need for the courts to be involved. And as a result of that, an additional Latino state Senate district was created, and additional House districts were created. And then the round after that, we were successful in creating more opportunities. The big difference between 1981 and 1991 and then 2001 was that some of us were then involved directly in the map-making process. And so that brings us to today, and this is my fourth round of redistricting. And today, what we see, what we have seen in the process is greater community involvement. Back in 1981, very few people even understood what the word redistricting meant. And so there wasn't a lot of community support for the process, not because people didn't want to support it, but because they just didn't understand it, and it was something that was totally new. This time around, in this fourth round of redistricting, through the involvement of the Latino agenda and other groups out there, not just in Chicago, but outside Chicago, and other groups, including Asian groups that have been very, very much involved in making sure that this time around they could make a difference, they could affect the shaping of the districts, because prior to this round of redistricting, even though Asian groups were involved 10 years ago, they weren't able to have the kind of impact that they were able to have this time. And so it is wonderful to see how the different segments of the population have engaged at in a much more aggressive manner in the redistricting process. That forced the Illinois General Assembly to hold a lot of hearings, many more hearings than in the past, and so there was more transparency, at least as far as the opportunity to provide testimony and to try and have input. But the fact of the matter is that today, just like it was back in 1981, the redistricting process is a very partisan process. And the primary goal, unstated goal, of redistricting is to protect incumbents. That is it. That's how it works, to protect incumbents and to protect majorities. If Republicans were in control of the process, and they weren't this time around because Democrats were the majority or are the majority in the House and the Senate, and they also have the governor's office. And the reason that's important is because when we talk about redistricting, it's just like passing a bill. You got to have a piece of legislation. The legislation contains the description of the districts, all the boundaries. It has to pass both chambers, and then it goes to the governor, and the governor signs it just like any other bill. Once the governor signs it, it becomes law. Now, in prior years, because one party didn't control all three, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, then, of course, it gets a little more complicated, and there's a process to allow for that. And it includes, if you can't have a commission that reaches an agreement on a map, then there's a tiebreaker, and then that name is selected, pulled out of a hat or out of a jar, and then that tiebreaker then determines who the majority is on the commission, Democrats or Republicans, and then the majority wins out, and that's the map that takes place. That did not have to happen this time around because the Democratic Party controls all three. And so the legislature conducted its hearings. It then drew a map. And all this talk about transparency is great. It's wonderful. But the fact of the matter is that the map that was approved, once it got amended, I think once, was unveiled towards the very end, with just days left in the legislative session. And of course, it had to be passed before the end of May, because if it had gone beyond May, then it would have required a supermajority, and that would have allowed then Republicans to then have a say in the map-making process. That's why the maps had to be approved based on the Democrats' role and concerns by the end of May. So the map with the legislative districts, the state houses, House districts, and the state Senate districts was unveiled towards the very end. I know that the groups, the community groups, did a wonderful job. And in the old days, it was pen and pencil, pen and paper. Now, computer, the information, the data, the files, the census data is made available to everyone. And what was wonderful about this time around is that the community groups, including the Latino Agenda and United Congress and other groups, actually produced maps. And they proposed maps. And at one point they said to the legislators, we've shown you our map, when are you going to show us your map? And finally, that map was made available, but that map fell short of what was proposed and advocated for by the coalitions that came together. And there were several groups that came together. Some coalitions, which involved multiracial groups, African Americans, Asians, Latinos, did advocate for a lot more districts at 65%, then we'll create it. Now, remember that number, 65% is a key number. And that number was established decades ago as the standard necessary to ensure an opportunity, a real opportunity, to elect a Latino or an African American to a district. It was an important number. And so the groups advocated for the creation of a total of 13 districts with 65% or more Latino population. And of course, Latino population is one thing. Latino voting age population is another. And that number drops. Because as you know, for Latinos more than any other group, we have undocumented individuals who were counted. We have permanent residents, legal permanent residents who were counted, who are not able to vote. They're part of that voting age population based on the census count, but they aren't able to cast a ballot. And that's why the 65% number for Latinos becomes even more important. Because if you don't go for that 65%, then the number drops. The voting age population could even drop close to 50% or below 50%. And then you consider other factors like turnout and other kinds of factors that need to be considered. So the agenda and United Congress and other groups advocated for the creation of 13 majority, 65% Latino districts. The map that the Democrats finally made public a few days before the end of the session only had seven. Well, it was 6, and then it went up to 7. 6 65% districts. They held one more hearing that we participated in where we made the case for the need for more 65% districts. As a result of that hearing, there was an amendment to the bill, Senate Bill 1175, House Amendment 2, and that amendment increased by 1 the number of districts at 65%. And guess which one that was? Speaker Madigan's district. Speaker Madigan's district is now, based on the map that was approved, a 66% Latino majority district. Just to show you how much growth there has been of the Latino population on the south side, southwest side. Tremendous growth. But even with making that one more district 65% and going from 6 to 7, it still doesn't match 13. And that brings me to the closing part, and that is why we have MALDEF. The Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund brought the first suit back in 1981 when there was no Latino representation. As a result of that suit, we have today not only Latino representation, but there were enough Latinos elected to even form a Latino legislative caucus. And that would not have happened without the battles that we've had over the years, over the decades in redistricting. Thanks to the Voting Rights Act, which is still in effect. The Federal Voting Rights Act makes it possible for these challenges to take place. And so now that the General Assembly has passed that map and also passed a congressional map, which, by the way, is an inadequate map, but all the community groups were all busy dealing with the state map, and not a whole lot of attention was paid to the congressional map. And so the General Assembly unveiled a congressional map because they have to do both maps, the state and the congressional, and they unveiled the congressional map just a couple of days before they voted on it. So there was no opportunity for input. And one of the things that's certain, just based on the numbers on the congressional map, is that while Illinois has lost one congressional district, we've gone from 19 to 18 because of the growth in population in other parts of the country. The fact of the matter is that this map still gives us only one congressional district at around 71% Latino population, and that's the district that we now have, the 4th Congressional District. And yet there are 3 congressional districts as part of this new map that have Latino population of 20% or more. Now, what could have been done, and what I hope will happen at some point, is that a 2nd congressional district, maybe not with 65%, but with somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% plus, could be created if MALDEF decides to challenge that. And MALDEF at this point is reviewing both the state map and the city, the congressional map, and they will make a determination as to whether or not they need to be challenged. It is my opinion, my personal opinion, that given the history, there's something to work with here, and that MALDEF should really, really carefully consider challenging the two maps. Because if you look at the history of Latino representation, even if you look at Aurora, where Linda Chapalavia was elected, in an area that wasn't expecting, it didn't have a majority district. The fact of the matter is that in the last map 10 years ago, that district was created as an influence district with a significant Latino population. Didn't reach 65%, but there was a significant Latino population, and that is what created the opportunity for Linda Chapalavia to be elected out there. Have there been exceptions? Of course there are. You could look at Schaumburg, and you could look at Representative Crespo's district. He doesn't have a Latino majority. He was elected. So there are exceptions, but history shows us that in order to increase the number of Latino elected officials at the state level and at the federal level, redistricting has to produce opportunities, and that the rule of thumb is 65%, and if you can't get 65%, you want as close to that 50% to present opportunities, not a guarantee, but opportunities to elect Latinos.
And very briefly, Miguel, why should I care? I mean, you explained the whole process, but why should a resident of La Villita or Pilsen or Humboldt Park care about what's going on here?
Because you have a voice. You have a voice. And sometimes that voice is not as strong as you want it to be. But you see, you can do something about that if you want to. If you organize, you can change who your representative is. You see, if you have someone who was elected in a Latino majority district, just like in any other district, and you're not satisfied with their performance, if they're not a strong enough voice for you, you can make that change. But racial block voting patterns still exist. And so the redistricting process is the best opportunity that African Americans and Latinos and Asians have to ensure that individuals who are going to represent the interests of the community, de corazón, as well as in every other respect, the best way to make sure that they have an opportunity to get elected is by creating these districts through the redistricting process. You see, and that voice is important. Now, most recent example, you talked about the state of Illinois DREAM Act, which is not like the federal DREAM Act. You see, years ago, a piece of legislation like that wouldn't have seen the light of day. I was there, folks. You couldn't move these kinds of things. Things have changed. Why? Because of the growth of the population. A 33% growth in the Latino population in the state of Illinois since the last census. And a lot of that growth is outside the city of Chicago. And so you have both Republican and Democratic legislators who are not minority legislators who are paying more attention. But it's not just paying attention to the numbers within their district, it's paying attention to the issues that get brought up in the General Assembly and listening to the debates and listening to the rationale and listening to the community organizations that come in larger numbers and lobby on the issues. It's an educational process that leads to sensitization, which then leads to support, increased support. It's as simple as that. And so if you are invisible, if you are absent, then you're not considered. You're not seen. And so when policy decisions have to get made, and we'll be later talking about how we still have a long ways to go in that respect, because folks, I'm involved in the education arena, and I work with Robin, I work with everyone here, and many times, as Sylvia will tell you, I go to all these meetings, Springfield, or all over the place, and I look around the room, and I'm still the only Latino in the room. And so we have a long ways to go, but yet we've made a tremendous gain. And it's through that increased political influence that I think we've been able to make the kind of dent that's been made. And again, redistricting, I'll remind you, occurs once every 10 years. And so if you don't take full advantage of it, you miss out on opportunities.
Now,
and Democrats have drawn a map that ensures, and I'll be criticized for making this statement, because I am a Democrat, and I served under a Republican majority and suffered greatly during that period. I have to speak the truth here. But the fact of the matter is that Democrats have drawn a map that will maximize the Latino vote as a Democratic vote in many districts that they feel that they'll be able to protect for partisan reasons. And so we're being counted on right now under this new map to deliver Democratic legislators in these districts. Frankly, I want to see the Republicans competing for that vote too. I think it's in the best interest of Latinos to have both parties aggressively competing. But right now, the map that's been proposed with a lot of districts at 40%, at 50%, are meant in many ways for the purpose of protecting the Democratic majority.
Thanks, Miguel. Now, Silvia, you've been involved in this process too. Give us your perspective.
Yeah, so just to highlight a couple of things. I think that the Latino Policy Forum, as many of you know, convened the Illinois Latino Agenda, which is a coalition of 49 groups that works on broader issues. But we had the subcommittee that worked on redistricting. And we were very pleased that many of you here in this room worked with us and testified, and we had so much more community input and participation in the process. We had people testify at least 10 different hearings throughout the process. We also work this time in a multiracial coalition, as Miguel has said, with United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations, so that it really was a broader communities of color saying these are the number of districts that can and should be drawn. Unlike in past years, we had both MALDEF and United Congress actually drawing maps for us, so we could see what it is that could be created, and that really was instrumental in this process. And you have, and we took the time to do this nice little color-coded thing for you, so I want to be brief. But as Miguel said, the biggest, what you have on the left is what we proposed. What you have on the right is what passed. The most important thing to pay attention to is the number of those purple districts, because as Miguel said, we showed that 13 could be drawn and only 7 were enacted. And that's actually a decrease. We lost ground because prior to redistricting, there were 8 65% Latino majority districts, and now there are only 7. So the consolation prize was that there are many more districts in the 50 to 64% Latino population range. There you can see that we proposed 4 and 12 were finally enacted. So in a sense, you know, we certainly made our voice heard. One of the downsides of this process was that in the final days of negotiation and going back and forth, and won't you settle for 6? And I said, 6 is an insult. How can you ask us to settle for 6 when 13 can be drawn? Is that a lot of what we put on the table in terms of keeping communities of interest intact actually was used against us. So we got, in a sense, more districts, more in the 50% range as a consolation prize, but then communities of interest were hurt. There was the initial dangling of keeping the Little Village intact for the first time ever as a district. In the final analysis, Little Village was split. Other communities of interest that we were hoping to keep together, like Back of the Yards and communities like McKinley Park and some of the other Southwest side communities, to keep them cohesive and in one district, they got split, right? So I said that there were tempered, there were victories, but they were really tempered and they came at a pretty high cost. You can sort of see the difference here in that the purple are the 65% districts, the red are the 50 to 64, and the yellow are the influence districts. But I think Miguel really did a nice job of summing it up. But since we're talking about redistricting, let me just thank and acknowledge Representative Lisa Hernandez, who's here, who's been one of our greatest friends and allies in this process. So thank you for coming. But we're also sorry to say that she is not happy with her district, and we're not happy with her district because she has less of Cicero than she had before, and went into different parts of the city. So while there were some gains and losses, they really did come at a pretty high price, I think, in terms of keeping communities of interest together. And it was also especially challenging because, as Miguel said, you know, the question is, in the redistricting process, we're supposed to choose our electeds. In this process, the electeds chose their voters, right? And I think that we clearly saw that in terms of the primacy of the Democratic incumbents. And this was especially nuanced because when we were advocating for the 13 supermajority Latino districts, a lot of our members, Latino members of the General Assembly, weren't happy about that. Because it meant different things for their district and how their district might need to be rearranged. So it was a much more dynamic process. It was a much more complex process. It wasn't as easy as in 1980 when there were no Latino incumbents. And I think, and certainly as I reflect on it, there's a lot of lessons learned for this process and how we think about it again in 10 years.
Thank you, Silvia. Silvia, now we'll move to another tough item, which is the budget. We all know the state of Illinois is going through a financial crisis, and a lot of organizations are very concerned about potential cuts, or they are already experiencing cuts, or they haven't seen the money that is owed to them from the state. So in terms of the human services, can you hear me? No. Now? Yeah, in terms of the impact on human services, I would like to ask Judith to give us your perspective on how the potential budget cuts will affect human services.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So before I begin, I want to make a personal thanks to Sylvia and Martin and the Latino Policy Forum for working with Illinois Partners and the coalition during the last, you can't hear me. Okay, so, is that better? Okay, thanks. For working together during the last session. And again, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the budget discussion, I want to say to each and every one of you in this room, it's not over. So I'm going to kind of just piggyback on a comment that was made about if you organize. May I use your language? So if you organize, I am asking before my presentation, and I will ask it repeatedly, that you keep in mind that when you leave here today, there are phone calls that need to be made today as the legislators are back in conversation around the budget. So this is not a done deal. So let me speak to a moment of who Illinois Partners is. So a group of human service providers about 2 years ago came together and said that there has been a constant and over time in battling among human service providers for the pennies that are left over every year in the budget. And what does that mean? So the aging group, the group in child care, the group in domestic violence, the group in disabilities, the group in housing, job training, child care, teen programs, refugee and immigration services, sexual assault, foster care, all fighting each other for the money in Springfield. And yet, the reality, folks, is all those groups are serving the same families. And so when the legislators are in session, they love the fact that we fight against each other, because then it helps them not have to make the tough decisions. And so Illinois Partners was formed for the sole purpose of joining all of these silo areas together under an umbrella coalition that would fight together for the families. Now, the vast majority of the revenue that I just spoke about, which impacts the Latino community, comes through the Department of Human Services. And so I'm going to speak a little bit to the devastation of that department over the last couple of years. And then I'm going to leave you with kind of what's happening today and my ask of you today to try to recoup some of these losses. So for those of you that know this, do some meditation for the next 3 minutes. The budget process in Illinois begins July 1st and ends June 30th. The budget process begins by determining how much money is in the state coffers to spend. So please just imagine that at the beginning of a year, you look at your income and figure out how much you have for the year and how much you have to spend. And the language that the state uses, which I find extremely confusing, is they use a word called appropriation or appropriate. And what they decide is they decide how much to appropriate for all the different things that they want to fund. And the fascinating piece is that in 1972, in the General Assembly, a commission was brought forward by the General Assembly called the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability. And future, I'm going to use the acronym COGFA. And the reason that was put together was to help determine how much money there really is in the state that they would have to spend every year. So just imagine, it's July 1st, COGFA is going to give a number, and everybody's going to go scramble now to figure out where you're going to put that money. So here's what really happened since July 1st. So COGFA came up with a number, and in February, the governor gave his budget address of where he wanted to appropriate money, and he had a larger number than what COGFA said was available. And then the Senate came up with their number, and their number was really darn close to what COGFA said there was to spend. And the House, excuse me, Representative, came up with $1 billion plus less in their budget to spend. So what did that mean? That means when they went in their little groups to decide where the money was going to go, they had $1 billion less to spend. And does anyone want to guess who took the biggest hit for that $1 billion loss? Human Services. So what does that mean? That means that the Senate passed their bill, the House came up with their notion of a budget, the House passed their bill, and they sent it over to the Senate, and the Senate, by golly, took the House's bill and the number, and that's what's right now sitting before the governor for signature. The Department of Human Services, in that budget, just this year, took a 17% cut in those services that I just told you about. 17%. In the interim, the Senate did a clever move. The Senate took a House bill that authorizes capital and road projects and amended it and added on over $400 million to it. And there's a sheet of paper on each of your chairs that does a description of what that $400 million is. And so what that would mean is that you would take the road projects and all of the things that right now the governor is saying, I'm not authorized to continue, meaning all your summer projects and construction jobs will just have to halt because of this add-on of this 400 plus million. But the thing to please note as you look at your sheet is that 50% of that add-on was to go to education and to be put back into education that was cut, and 50% was put back for services in human services. So my ask of you is that when you leave here, you call your House representative and tell her or him that you want pressure to be put on Leader Madigan, Speaker Madigan, to appropriate and sign that bill again, I really want you to take note. That is House Bill 2189, Senate Amendment 1, to reinstate the money. And the key here, folks, is this is not extra taxes. This is not extra money. This is money that is already there and money that is going to hurt our communities if we don't reinstate this money.
Thank you. Now, Sylvia, could you give us, from your point of view, what will be the impact on the Latino community?
So also on your chairs, you have this state grants to Latino nonprofits. And this is brand new analysis that we've just conducted that basically shows, and you all know, that over the past decade, the Latino population grew by 33%. What this analysis shows us is that the state is investing about $78 million in Latino nonprofit organizations. But when we were looking at this analysis, we found there were two that got major dollars, and those are primarily, we think, for capital. So the real impact, if you look at the bottom there, is more like $56 million. You can see that over the past few years, when we've conducted this analysis, that the amount invested in the Latino community has only grown by 3%. 3% over the past 2 years. But if you look at that very top line, all state grants to nonprofit organizations, the amount that the state gives out actually increased by 18%. So the Latino population increase is not proportionate to the state's increase in grant giving. The amount that goes to Latino organizations is not proportionate to the 33% Latino growth over the past decade. And in fact, what it means is it's just basically at level funding, many of you as providers out there, to get the same amount of grant increase to provide critically needed services in health and human services and domestic violence prevention and youth services, it really means because the community grew by 33% and there's only a 3% increase, you're basically operating at a 33% loss, right? Because if we're not investing 33% more, the Latino community is losing ground. And we now have the data for the first time to provide this kind of analysis just from last year, just over the past couple of years. What we also know from this analysis, and you can see where all the different agencies are that are getting awarded, is that there are only 66 Latino organizations that receive funding from the state, and we know that there are well over 200 Latino organizations in the state. So why aren't more of our organizations getting critically funded services, resources to provide services to our community? And we further know that at least half of the amount that goes to Latino nonprofit organizations, like many of you here in the room, comes from one department, and that's the Illinois Department of Human Services. So to Judith's point, the need and the place where the budget has been most dramatically cut is getting cut in human services. And now that contracts are in the process of getting settled and allocated and dispersed, those grant amounts and those dollars are going to be most severely cut in human services. And if half of the dollars that the state gives out to Latino organizations is in human services, then what does that mean? It means that our community is going to be adversely impacted because the investment is not keeping pace with our growth, and because it's the state agency that's been impacted the most dramatically, human services, is where literally half of the organizations that we work with get their resources from.
Well, thanks. It sounds like bad news, and it's not only reporters that tell the bad news. They can't hear me all the way in the back. Can you hear me now?
No, it's not working.
Let me see if it.
Yeah.
This one works, right? Yeah. Thanks. No, I was just saying that it's not only reporters that have to give you the bad news. Now we'll move to early childhood education, another key topic that we're going to talk about today, and we're looking for good news. So we turn to Robin, and I guess there were some progressive pieces of legislation passed in this session. So tell us about that.
All right. The bad news is I have good news and bad news because I will touch on the budget as well. So, and the good news is that we did do some exciting things in the last 18 months. So I'll go a little bit beyond this session to a little bit before. Illinois is now one of the first, Sylvia, only states that actually requires that bilingual early childhood be made available where there is a need. So where you've got kids who need early childhood bilingual, the state is now obliged, districts are now obliged to make that available. That's huge. And of course, there's going to be a gap between saying we're going to do that and having the capacity to do that. Advance Illinois, which is the organization I work for, came out with a report card, and we showed that there's a huge gap between the number of teachers that are ready to provide that and the number of facilities who are in fact serving children who need it. Having said that, the state in general of Illinois tends to lead when it comes to early childhood. We've made a significant investment over a sustained period of time to try and make sure that more 3- and 4-year-olds are getting the services that they need. We're trying to catch up on birth to 3, though we've got work to do there. And one of the things that happened over the last year is a statewide working group that was convened by the state superintendent, Chris Cook, and facilitated by the Ounce of Prevention Fund, Erickson Institute, and Advance Illinois. Groups from around the state came together and said it's time for us to join a group of leading states in having a developmentally appropriate way of understanding where our kids are as they're entering the K-12 system. So as they're wrapping up their early childhood, how are they doing? Are they cognitively ready? Do they have early literacy skills? Are they socially and emotionally where we need them to be as they're starting the K-12 system? Physically, are they adjusting? And do they have the right, are there any other issues attitudinally in terms of doing well in school? And the even better news is that even in tight times, the State Board of Education was willing to redeploy $1.5 million to identify the instrument that matched the recommendations and to actually do a pilot phase of that work in a handful of districts. Then the bad news is that in the House budget it got cut, even though these were pre-existing funds that were just being redeployed. So do make that call on 2189 and do advocate that we try to put those dollars back in. But the fact that you had people from all corners of the state coming together for that actually is a very positive move, would put Illinois at the head of the pack. And one way or another, we're going to find a way to fund that. We're going to get that work started, and more on that in just a moment. Another positive development is you know that just over a year ago, the governor convened the P20 Council. P is just preschool, 20 is grade 20, and so this is a council that's designed to bring together people from early childhood to talk to kindergarten through 12th grade, to talk to higher ed, to create a more seamless system of education. And the best news is they appointed Miguel Del Valle as chair of that council, which is huge, and he's done a wonderful, yeah, you could applaud for that. And what that automatically means is that you've got some much more coordinated conversations going. And one of the first things that the group has decided to do is tackle the state report card. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever read, the state puts out a report card every year that gives you some feedback on how your individual school is doing and how your district is doing and how the state is doing. Raise your hand if you've ever read that. Keep your hand up if you think it's a really good, readable, useful document. Yeah. We've got a lot of work to do on that, and so I'm delighted to tell you that there is also statewide conversations happening under the leadership of the P20 Council to dramatically revise the state report card. And what I expect will happen by this veto session, hold us to this, is that you're going to see a revamped and revised report card approved that you'll get to see next year as families, community members, and parents. And it will have a summary that you can actually follow that will give you actionable information. And it will start with early childhood information, and it will carry through and tell you what happens to your kids as they leave the kindergarten 12 system and go into higher education. And so it'll give you a clearer picture with more actionable information. And we're conducting focus groups around the state as we speak this summer to try and make sure that we've got ground level feedback on that. So I think that's just going to be very, very useful and helpful information, and while it's not as controversial and sexy and doesn't make it into the papers, arguably it's going to have more of an impact than some of the sexier things that happened this year. And let me touch on one other sexy thing, an exciting pot of money that's coming, and then one last thing on the budget. One of the sexier things that happened is there was, and this has been a controversial issue, many of you are, I have 3 kids in the Chicago Public Schools, like other districts, they have had layoffs and cutbacks, and you know, this has been a difficult period of time for most districts. And one of the things that the legislature looked at this year was, if you have to make tough decisions on who's teaching in our schools and who's working in our schools, how are we going to make those decisions? And are they going to be made primarily based on seniority and who's been in the school the longest, or are we going to look and see what needs the personnel is filling and the job that they're doing? And the legislature came down and said, look, we really want to be making decisions based on who's serving our kids the best. So those changes are going to start going into effect around the state over the next few years. Finally, the federal government, you may have heard, has issued something called an early learning challenge. They put $700 million, and they've made it available to states on a competitive basis for up to $30 to $40 million. That's not going to solve our early learning challenges, but that's nice additional money for the state to use to tackle some key challenges. One of those I fully expect is going to be this issue around bilingual early childhood. So that's come up early in conversations. I expect Illinois to be a very strong competitor for those dollars. And so that's a bright spot in an otherwise bleak budget time. So feel free to reach out and call and talk to your legislators about that as well, and tell them you're expecting to see them bring that money home. And then lastly, on the budget, we've got an analysis of what happened to the education budget. I don't think it's on your chairs. I think it's on the resource table if you want to take a look at it. One of the things you'll note is that early childhood took a 5% across-the-board cut. Bilingual education took an across-the-board 5% cut. And some of the reform work that the state had been moving along on, including kindergarten readiness, just as a small example, you know, some significant legislation passed, and then the budget went ahead and zeroed those lines out. So we've got some reconciling to do. So I'm hopeful that the Senate move to bring everybody back into the session on June 22nd will shake those things up a little bit.
And I know, Miguel, you wanted to talk about education too. And let me ask you a question first. We have a number of Latinos now appointed to high positions in education. We have Gary Chico, we have Silvia Puente serving on an important board. We also have Jesse Ruiz. Will that make a difference?
Well, it makes a difference.
There you go.
It's on now.
It makes a difference. Yeah,
It's not on.
Should we pass this down?
Try again. I'll do this.
how's this one? You have it? It certainly makes a difference, of course. For those of you who don't know, Sylvia is the chair of the Education Funding Advisory Board, known as EFAB in the state of Illinois. That was a board that was statutorily created, and their task is to, every 2 years, recommend the level of per-pupil spending in the state of Illinois, as well as how the poverty grants are distributed throughout school districts in the state of Illinois. And while Sylvia has done her job, and the Education Funding Advisory Board made recommendations, the fact of the matter is that we've never been able to fund per-pupil spending at the level recommended by EFAB since EFAB was established. We've never reached that mark. And the sad commentary today is that even though, as you know, many of us for many years advocated for an income tax increase to change how we fund public education in the state of Illinois, the fact of the matter is that the increase came, but it didn't go to education. And so now we're struggling with trying to get this amendment to this capital bill approved, because it does include $152 million for the general state aid formula, which is where the per pupil spending comes from, at least the state share of the per pupil spending. We do have Gary Chico, who's now chairing the State Board of Education. I am the chairman of the P20 Council, and the governor just recently appointed me to the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. That's where the financial aid comes from, the MAP grants for all our folks going on to community colleges and four-year public and private institutions, as well as the proprietary schools. And then in the legislature, we have Linda Chapalavia, who is the chair of the House Elementary and Secondary Education Committee. And Representative Hernandez is also on a number of the education committees, and she's vice chair. And in the Senate, Senator Martinez is a member of the Senate Education Committee. And so we have more Latinos in leadership roles today in the education arena at the state level than we've had before, but it is going to be very important that we come together and develop a strategy that allows us to certainly take care of the big picture, while at the same time advancing agenda items that are important to not just the Latino community, but the African American community and the Asian community. Because folks, we are now at a point where almost half of the 2 million students in preschool through 12th grade public education in the state of Illinois are students of color. Almost half of the 2 million. And yet we're struggling with issues. Robin, I want to mention that because Sylvia and I are members of the Advance Illinois Board. As a matter of fact, we're co-founders of Advance Illinois. And one of the issues that we've been working on is teacher and leader effectiveness, trying to improve the effectiveness of teachers. And that led to the state of Illinois adopting a new evaluation system or requirements for teachers, and then Senate Bill 7, which was just signed this week, that ties a lot of things to that evaluation. And then prior to that, earlier in the year, a new method for training principals in the state of Illinois was adopted, and administrative rules were recently approved. But one of the things that is happening in the process is that because we're changing the rules, it will have an impact on the number of Latino teachers produced in the state of Illinois. It will also have an impact on the number of Latino principals produced in the state of Illinois, and of course, superintendents and others. We don't have very many superintendents. I think we only have one in the entire state. But it is something to watch, because while we want to ensure that the quality is there, we want a quality teacher in a classroom where our kids are at, and for us, that's the most important thing. And we don't want an incompetent Latino principal or an incompetent Latino teacher teaching our kids. We don't want that. It hurts. It hurts our kid. But on the other side of that is the need to make sure that we are creating the kinds of support systems that are necessary in order to bring individuals up to the level where they need to be in order to be able to then compete on a level playing field with the folks who are going to have the future teaching jobs and the future jobs principals. And that's a challenge. We raised the cut score on the basic skills test, which is required of all teacher candidates. In order to get admitted into the colleges of education, and the colleges of education will tell you right now that there has been a dramatic decline in the number of African American and Latino admitted to the colleges of education. That has some real long-term impact. So the question is, what are we doing to make sure that these candidates, that these individuals who want to become teachers, are able to prepare adequately to pass that basic skills test? And what are we doing to prepare individuals to make sure that they can then enter those principal training programs that have tougher, more stringent requirements now?
Robin, would you like to comment?
I was just going to add one note, and I'm so glad Miguel touched on that. That was one of the budget highlights. There is some money actually in the budget to try and build the pipeline specifically to make sure that that in the effort to raise expectations and standards for new principals and teachers, that we work on making sure that that pipeline remains diverse and trying to start earlier and reach down. So that money actually did not get cut, even in the final version. And just one other note, because Sylvia's worked so hard on the Education Funding Advisory Board, that their recommendation, the state actually argued that it was going to maintain per pupil funding, which is right now $6,119, or is it $6,119? But they deliberately appropriated $152 million less than is required to do that, so to credit for the cut while simultaneously trying to take credit for maintaining the GSA level, which Somebody will explain that to me someday politically, how that all works. I'm just a simple-minded gal, and I don't get that. But we're over $2,000 right now below what the recommended EFAB level is for per pupil spending. Over $2,000 a child less. So just keep that in mind as you're talking with your legislators.
Finally, we'll talk about the representation or lack of representation of the state workforce. And as probably you know, the Latino Forum, the Latino Policy Forum did an analysis about the number of Latinos working in the state government in the last 10 years and how many of them have been added to that workforce and what is the balance and the percentage that we have seen now. Sylvia, could you please give us a little bit more of that analysis?
Sure. So part of what we did, and it's nice that there's legislation and that all these reports are readily available, but we actually did analysis and we looked at the 10 largest state agencies. And our basic premise is that we can't adequately provide services to the Latino community. We can't fully do that. We can't ensure cultural competency. We can't ensure that services are delivered in Spanish to Spanish-speaking clients unless we have a diverse workforce. So it's not to say that someone that's not Latino can't work with a Latino stakeholder or client, but we all know it matters when you see someone that looks like you and who can speak your language. So when we look at the 10 largest state agencies, what we find is that only 4.7% of employees who work for government are Latino. And that's in stark contrast to the Illinois workforce, which has, because we are so large, we're 14% of people who work in Illinois are Latino, but less than 5% of the state's workforce is Latino. We can see that that's a huge gap there. We also did analysis that showed that unfortunately last year, even though there were 2,600 promotions or hirings, only 200 of them were to Latinos. And we also did analysis that shows that over the past 10 years, there's people that take a job, leave a job, someone else gets hired, someone leaves, but we've only seen a net gain in 150 more Latinos working for government in 2010 than there were in 2000. We went from 1,975 employees to, we went from 1,000, losing my numbers here, 1,937 Latino employees in 2000 to 2,087 in 2010. So the state, you know, I'm usually the analyst, but I have to say the state has failed miserably in ensuring that its workforce truly represents the diversity of the state's population and of the clients and people that it serves. And in addition to the grants that we talked about, we know that this has a dramatic impact and how our community is really not served to a large extent by state government.
Thanks. Now, before we open the microphones for your questions, I would like to ask each of the panelists to give us closing remarks. Miguel, would you like to start?
Well, first of all, as Sylvia indicated, we have numbers to look at, and the Latino Policy Forum has done a fantastic job, and I think we are indebted to them for the tremendous amount of work that's been done. They worked closely with the Latino Legislative Caucus and have been able to generate a lot more information than ever before. The hiring numbers are there, and the reason you have access to those numbers is because years ago, we were able to legislate a requirement that those numbers be collected and that the state have an Hispanic hiring plan. And I see Carmen here, who chaired the Illinois Association of Hispanic State Employees, and they worked very hard also to make sure that that plan was in place. But as the workforce has begun to shrink, Latinos have been hit hard by people being let go, as well as not enough individuals being hired for the positions that are available, in many cases because of departments claiming that they can't find people with the credentials that they're looking for and the experience. And of course, we never buy that. And so I thank you for putting these numbers out and encourage everyone to find a way of engaging in the advocacy activity that's necessary to make sure that every legislator is aware of these numbers and in some way commits, as well as the governor's office and the offices of the constitutional officers that need to be included, and the institutions of higher learning, the public universities that receive a ton of money from the state. Not as much as they used to, but they still get a lot of funding. So I thank you for the work that you've done. It's excellent.
So let me add that in addition to human services being provided by local community-based organizations that many of you are employed by, we are also an economic engine in a community. So we don't just provide services for people, we also employ people, and the people that we employ typically reside in those communities and are the economic engine in those communities. So when I ask you to please pick up the phone and call and advocate for money to be put back in the budget for programs, they are directly going to impact your community. And as we continue our work, I just want to remind you that working together in advocacy really can matter. As I listen to my fellow panelists talk about the work that they do collectively, it is really with all of our voices together that can make the difference. If we don't, believe me, no one will do it on our behalf. So I ask you again to please consider what it is that we do and the work that we do in the communities to advocate for us to be fully funded for the people in our communities. Thanks.
You all know that the fastest growing, is it not working for me? Oh. You guys all know that the fastest growing part of the population is the Latino population, and the growth and the spread of that, as was referenced earlier, is affecting how education is dealt with at the state level, I think in a very healthy and a very desirable way. And so general trends to try and improve the level of educational opportunity for all students benefits everybody, but there's no question that there's an increased focus from what there has been in past years on the need to close the achievement gap. Illinois continues to have one of the worst achievement gaps in the country. And if we could simply close the gap here in Illinois, we would add billions to the economy, and it would be a huge, both the upside on the economic front, the upside in terms of social outcomes, voting patterns, the drops in incarceration, et cetera, would be enormously beneficial. I think that is beginning to penetrate and sink in, and some of the recent moves around particularly reaching out to Latino and bilingual students early on is one of the many beneficial side effects. So the hope is that we'll have more good news to share at the end of next year's session.
So I think as Paul mentioned in his opening remarks, we're under the banner of the Latino Policy Forum for 3 years now. And if you haven't, while we're still a very small organization, if you haven't figured it out by now, a lot of our focus is on addressing state policy. And we're focused on working with many of you on how do we increase these hiring numbers, the grants to Latino organizations, the resources that come into our community on education, on housing, and on immigration. We know that there's a lot more to be done beyond looking at just the state, but we're going to do what we can in these areas. And I'm really so pleased that the way we see our work and the way we see our role right now is that while we can do these kinds of analyses and put out this kind of data and information, the forum part of our name is that we really do nothing alone. Many of you are members of our Illinois Latino agenda, and if not, we invite your organizations to be part of that. Many of your organizations are part of our acuerdos, and you know we have them in early child education, in housing, and in immigration. So that it really is a key partnership that we have with you, the providers who really provide the direct services to our community, to say, how do we work on this together? So that we are making sure that any policy or initiative that we're working on really has the input from the people that are most affected and are most impacted. So we are building tremendous partnerships with many, many of our Latino organizations, and I added it up the other day and said we're in regular contact with 120 individuals in about 80 different organizations on a regular basis through all of our work, and that is so key and so important to our movement forward. But that also, as you can see today, that we're engaged in broader partnerships with our friends at Advance, with the Human Service Partnership, you know, with the broader array of stakeholders who are advocating on these issues as well, to ensure that there is that Latino voice, there is that Latino perspective in the broader agenda that we work on together as well. And we're really pleased with the partnerships and the allies that we have in moving forward. So as I look at things, you know, I'm a cautious optimist, but also a pragmatist. And if I wasn't the optimist, I still couldn't be doing this work. But it is just the reminder to all of us. It's not just about our numbers. It's about our maturity. It's about our influence. It's about our ability really to be able to work together. Because what we say is, you know, while we certainly have spoken to some of the challenges today, we know that Latinos bought half of all new homes in this state. All the home ownership increase. Half of those new homes were bought by Latinos. We know that 60% of the new entrants into the labor market, 6 out of every 10 new jobs over the past decade, is being filled by a Latino. So while we have our challenges, we also are one of the economic engines of this state. And most of you know that I usually say it really is an interdependent economy, and that it really is our shared future. Because this state and this region won't do well unless the Latino population does well. And we're very pleased to be in partnership with you and so many of our other allies in coming together the forward vision and creating that forward vision of what it is to have equitable investment in the Latino community. So, adelante.